Good morning, good evening, or good night, whichever one it is for you. Whichever one it is, I'm very glad you're here to join me for this week's video because today we're going to talk about all of the books I read in May, which is always the most exciting video to film because these are like little diaries of all the things I read so I can look back on them and just share all of the amazing literature I've been reading with you. Because let me tell you, I don't think I've ever had a month where I've read this many great books, like really honestly amazing books. I actually found a new favorite author of all time. I think I found someone who's actually dethroned Mishima as my favorite author. It's not been long enough where I can actually confidently claim that because Mishima has been my favorite author for a long time now, and this author I've only just discovered, but still, who knows, for now, she's my favorite of all time, which is crazy. I never thought that would happen. Overall, it was such a successful month. So let's just get right into it because at the beginning of the month, Blue, you're kind of distracting me. Can you stop this? Okay, she's just gonna be here. They're always very excited when I sit on the floor because then they think it's playtime, but that's not what's gonna happen right now. Okay, without further ado, let's get right into the first book I read, which is Mr. Mercedes by Stephen King. At the beginning of the month, I sort of went through a little bit of a Stephen King binge because I wanted to only read his books. So this is what I started with. Mr. Mercedes is the first book in a trilogy. This book starts out during a job fair that is created by the government to help people who've just lost their job to get a new one because of the economy crash. And so people have been lining up in front of that fair the whole night through. And there's a huge crowd of people in front of it, all people who are desperate to get jobs. And we're in the head of one of the people who are lining up there, and we get to know him and the people around him. And then in the early morning hours, this crazy person drives with a Mercedes, a car, through the crowd, injuring and killing a lot of people. It's made even more impactful because we've been in the head of one of the victims, and we've just intimately gotten to know this person, and now suddenly this horrible thing has occurred to them. It just makes it more personal, which I found was a very effective way of telling this beginning part of the story. Then we skip to a year later, and we're in the head of Bill Hodges, who's going to be our main character. He's a recently retired detective who's sort of been struggling with the lack of purpose because his job is now no longer there to fill up his life. And suddenly he feels like his life is completely empty. Also, he's haunted by this Mr. Mercedes tragedy because he's never solved the case. And that's sort of never really left him alone. Then suddenly he gets this letter, this taunting letter by Mr. Mercedes, the killer, who's taunting him. And because of this letter basically starts this sort of cat and mouse chase. We switch chapter by chapter between Bill Hodges, the detective, and Mr. Mercedes, the person who committed that crime. It's very engaging, very fast-paced. It's very brutal and very disturbing in the way that Stephen King manages to write basically all of his stories, but this is the first true crime kind of novel I've read by him. There's one thing that I struggle with Stephen King, and in this book it became very apparent, but not in a way where it's screaming at you. It's not overly iffy, but the way he writes black people, there's one main character, he's called Jerome. He's this young black guy who's really, really intelligent, but the way he's written is it made me a bit uncomfortable. It's not outright racist or anything, at least I don't think it is. I kept questioning, am I too sensitive here, or is this something that has to be mentioned? But I thought I'd just mention it. That's my personal experience with the book. That made me a bit uncomfortable. But apart from that, I really like this story, particularly the little trio that forms because Bill Hodges starts to hunt the Mercedes killer, and through that he has this friendship with Jerome, who's a lot younger than Bill Hodges, but they sort of have this unlikely friendship going on with which I really liked. And also they meet this woman called Holly, who's really neurotic and sort of she's very quirky but so lovable, and she's my favorite character in this book. I don't think that's a very unpopular opinion. I think most people like Holly the most. It's just I like the dynamic those three had going on. Then I had to, of course, read Finders Keepers, which is the continuation of that story. This takes place between two timelines. One starting in 2010, sort of the present day timeline of this story, where we follow Pete, who's a little boy whose father was one of the victims of the Mr. Mercedes massacre. And so we get to see the consequences that has had on this family and the destruction it's brought for all of them. He one day finds this box under a tree buried, and the box contains a lot of money and also many manuscripts, and he takes it home. The second timeline takes place in 1979, so quite a few years back, where we're in Morris's head, who has just killed his favorite author in order to acquire unpublished handwritten manuscript that this writer has created over the past few decades but never published. He refuses to publish them, and so Morris has just killed this man in order to get his hands on these manuscripts. That happens right before he gets imprisoned for 3 decades. And so when he gets out of prison over 30 years later, the timelines merge because now Morris is looking for his manuscripts. Also, of course, the 3 main characters of the first novel, Bill and Holly and Jerome, are also in this story because they've now created this sort of detective agency called Finders Keepers, which is where the title of the story comes in. As for my feelings about this book, I am a bit conflicted because I liked the story, but there were a lot of things that I found very disturbing. There's a lot of trigger warnings in this story, especially for sexual assault. There's a lot of that in here, which I was not blue. This is very unfitting right now. We're talking about serious topics. My goodness. So that's very hard for me to read about, which made this story a bit tough to get through. There were points where I was actually debating if I wanted to continue or not because it just got so extreme. In the end, I'm glad I kept going. I liked where the story went. Then I read The Dark Half, also by Stephen King. You can see there's a theme here. This story starts out when Thad Beaumont, our main character, is very young. He's 11 years old, and he keeps getting these migraines, these headaches that eventually turn into seizures. He knows when those migraines are coming because he starts seeing and hearing birds everywhere, specifically sparrows. Remember that? It gets important later. He has this really bad seizure, and the doctors decide they're going to operate on him because they think he has a tumor in his head. They see something in an X-ray. And so he gets operated on. What is inside his brain is not a tumor, turns out, but the remnants of a twin he consumed in utero. And those remnants, there's like eyes and teeth and fingernails in his brain, embedded in his brain. And they've just started growing randomly again. And that is what is causing these seizures. And so, of course, the doctors take it out. Years pass and he becomes a successful writer. He's been writing under a pen name who he's recently killed because he decides he wants to write under his own name again. That is when mysterious things start to happen because suddenly people start turning up dead around Thad, people he's connected with. One thing that's very interesting, and this is where the sparrows come in, is at the crime scene of one of the murders, which is a very brutal murder, there's writing on the wall in blood. And the writing says, "The sparrows are flying again." And that's where I'll leave you because this story, it's actually written here. Can you see that? The sparrows are flying again. Awesome. This story really, I think this story actually, I loved it so much that it now rivals Insomnia for my favorite Stephen King. It's not quite there. Insomnia is still my favorite. I don't know if that'll ever be pushed off of its throne because I really, really love Insomnia. But The Dark Half is a very close second because I just loved this story. There were so many awesome lines. I was so invested in this story. I flew through it. In my opinion, these are the kinds of stories that he's the best at and where he really shines and where he has something very unique. Now, we're gonna have a bit of a mood change because then I read Death in Venice by Thomas Mann. The German title here you can see, Der Tod in Venedig. Now you've got a little German lesson. This story is about Gustav Aschenbach, who's a successful writer who takes a walk one day and decides, I need a change, I feel stuck, I don't like my routine, so I'm going to travel now. And during his travel, he decides, no, I want to be in Venice. Venice is where I want to go. And so he does. He goes to Venice. And there he meets this boy, Tacho, who's from a Polish family. They do not speak the same name. They cannot communicate. But somehow he finds this boy so beautiful and so inspiring. Gustav Aschenbach is in his 30s. This boy is 14 years old. But yeah, he becomes absolutely obsessed with this boy. This boy becomes his muse. They cannot communicate. They have not had a single conversation. But yeah, this is his new spark that he needed to write. And so he starts writing like a crazy person, and his life has suddenly gotten meaning again. And then in Venice, there's a plague that breaks out, the cholera. Gustav Aschenbach decides, no, I'm not going to leave Venice because Tacho is here. So I'd rather die than be separated from Tacho. And so he stays there, even though he knows how dangerous that is. Gustav Aschenbach is basically meant to represent the decline of the bourgeoisie at the time. Also just of Germany as a whole, because obviously Thomas Mann dealt a lot with the uprise of fascism in Germany and just the extremist thinking that started to be much more prevalent in Germany at the time. And he wrote a lot of societal critiques, and this is definitely one. It's a very short book, so it's quite fast paced. You don't get bored with it like with other Thomas Manns, I've realized. It's obviously very morally gray. Gray, more like extremely dark. Morally not very good, but it is still interesting. That's Death in Venice. Then I read Dr. Faustus, which I've decided is going to be my last Thomas Mann. Unless I sort of get an itch suddenly, I will not pick up another one, because this is the fourth one I've read by him, and it was the most boring of his works, which I feel so sorry about, because this is not only his most controversial book, but also his most critically acclaimed book. I think objectively seen, it might be his best from an artistic standpoint, but I just found it profoundly boring, which I feel very sorry about, but it made me think that maybe Thomas Mann is just not the author for me. That's just my personal opinion. I think he's a very good author, but maybe not the one for me. For this story, Thomas Mann took the story of Goethe's Faust in order to write a critique of Nazi Germany at the time. The story is told from the perspective of Dr. Zeitblum. He's our narrator, and he's just decided he's going to write the biography of his childhood friend called Adrian Leverkühn, who we find out was a very genius musician. He was talented from a very young age. We follow Adrian's entire life through the eyes of Dr. Zeitblum, and we meet him when he's still very young, and it becomes very apparent that Adrian has always sort of been different. He's always been very emotionally cold and removed from his surroundings. He doesn't seem to really feel very deeply. At least that's how it comes across. This is one of the things that I found interesting in the story, because we're never actually in Adrian's head. It's the story of his life, but we don't ever get to hear his own perspective of things. And so it's very removed in a way. It's very hard to empathize with any of these characters. Adrian is apparently modeled after the biography of Nietzsche, because Nietzsche also, which is something that happens to Adrian, was infected with syphilis when he was very young, and syphilis became a very prominent factor in Nietzsche's mental decline. Nietzsche sort of became a bit mad during the last years of his life. The same thing happens to Adrian. We follow his mental and physical decline. There are pages upon pages of philosophy and theory of music, which you really have to find interesting. I found it very boring because that took up so much of this story. The Faustian aspect, which is why I decided I wanted to read this story, because I found this premise so fascinating. How are you going to tell the story of Nazi Germany inspired by Goethe's Faust? I thought there were so many elements you could put into this story and so many ways that could be done, and so I was so fascinated by it. This was the Thomas Mann I was the most excited about reading. But it turns out the Faust aspect is just this very small part, because we find out Adrian has given documents, written documents to his childhood friend, to Zeitblum, the narrator, after his death. He's basically inherited those from Adrian, and it's why Zeitblum decided he's gonna write this biography, because these documents are written accounts of conversations Adrian had with the devil to basically gain inspiration. The only part I really found interesting was the undercurrent of the uprise of fascism during the story, because we follow the story throughout several decades, basically before the First World War all the way up to during the Second World War. But it's never focused on enough for me to really keep being engaged. We won't all vibe with the same authors. That being said, one thing that's really cool about Thomas Mann is no two books of his are even remotely similar. There's a little bit of everything, and so there's a high chance you're gonna enjoy at least one of his books. Maybe just try him, maybe give him a few shots to really make sure you don't like him like I did. Next up, I read Last Words from Montmartre, which is such a raw and intimate account of our main character's physical and mental decline. It tells the story of the very obsessive and abusive and extreme relationship between two women. It basically deals with the aftermath of this relationship. It's told in fragmented letters that can be read at any point. They don't have to be read in order according to the author. It was so raw and intimate, and a very almost disturbing insight into this woman's psyche. There's a lot of commentary about the way society viewed sexuality at the time. It is very valuable. It's just a very hard book to read, and I think you have to really make sure you're in the right headspace for it. Next up, I read Autobiography of Red by Anne Carson. Anne Carson is someone I fell in love with this month. I'd never picked up a book by her, but first of all, the cover, I think it's so stunning. It's one of the most beautiful books I've ever seen. And what's inside it is even more beautiful. Holy shit, this woman can write. This is a fictional autobiography, and it's told sort of as a modern retelling of Greek mythology, and it's very abstract and symbolic. It's a very poetic, creative way of writing an autobiography. It's a book like nothing I've ever read. It's told in verse. It's basically a coming of age story. That's really all I want to tell you, because it is not the longest book, and I think if you go into it not knowing anything, that's really all you need to know. One of the best books I read this month. Next up, actually talking about great books, I read Voices of the Fallen Heroes and Other Stories by Yukio Mishima, who, you may already know this, I might have already said it in this video, is my favorite author, or was my favorite author. Maybe he's now in second place. Maybe he's sharing first place. We're gonna have to see about that. This is the last fictional thing by him I had not read. And so I've been savoring this for months now. I've owned this since January, which is when it came out. It's newly published. I finally decided to read it because it kept staring at me and taunting me, and I just couldn't wait anymore. I don't really have a lot of self-control like that. This is a collection of short stories Mishima wrote in the 1960s. Some of these stories are autobiographical in a way I've never read by Mishima, because Mishima doesn't usually write autobiographical books. It's never that intimate, like for example books by Dazai are. It's a typical kind of Mishima book because he deals with the juxtaposition of beauty and violence and just this incredibly lyrical prose and these minute insights into life, and his way of observing life is just, it screams from the page in every book he writes, but it's no different here. The title story, Voices of the Fallen Heroes, is maybe my favorite. It's a documentation of a seance that a group of people attend where a monk channels souls of the dead, specifically people who have died for a cause, basically fallen heroes. Pick that up, Voices of the Fallen Heroes. We have Didier Ribon's Eine Arbeiterin. Arbeiterin is the female version of a worker. Didier Ribon is a French sociologist. Technically, these books that he writes are called auto-sociobiographical books, which means he writes autobiographies of himself and the people in his life, considering the sociological impact of their life and the societal circumstances surrounding their life and impacting their life. So it's at once an autobiography as well as a sociological study of that particular time he's dealing with. I had to read this for uni because it's very relevant to my field of study. This is Didier Eribon writing about his mom. It's the account of how she moves into a care facility for seniors because she's lost mobility and she's lost the ability to take care of herself. It deals a lot with the psychological impact of the move into a care facility as the move to the place where you know you're gonna die. What that does to a person, specifically someone like his mom, who she hasn't declined mentally, it's just her body that's declined, and her body has sort of become a prison for her. We see that and how difficult that is for her through the eyes of her son who loves her. It reminded me of Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain in a way, because there also you're in a sanatorium where it's talked about how when you're in an institution that's shut off from the outside world, a complete own microcosm is created in there because they're just shut off from the outside world. It's a very interesting insight into human psychology in that way. It raises a lot of awareness for the mistreatment of the elderly in our society. He also looks at his own family dynamic, of course, and what the fact that they were lower working class people, what that did to their dynamic, how that impacts his mom's aging process, and just what that does to people and in what way social standing affects how we are and who we are. Next up, I read Charlotte Bronte's Shirley. This is an audiobook. I did not read it physically. It's a very unique book among the Bronte works because this does not follow one singular main character. We follow a group of people. This is an examination of England at the time of the Napoleonic War, what that did to the economy and to the people of England. You could say the two main people we're focusing on are Shirley and Caroline, who are cousins, who are very, very different people. Shirley is very feisty and outspoken and loud, and she's a very, very strong character, whereas Caroline is very composed and quiet and almost stoic, but also equally strong, just in an entirely different way. They're antitheses of each other almost. Their relationship with each other is one of my favorite relationships between women I've ever read about. They have this, they're such opposites of each other, but they have this incredibly loyal and deep connection to each other. That made me love this book so much, and it made it stand out so much. And so I'm very glad I picked this up. It was a joy to read. Then I read The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, which is a book I've been wanting to read for so long, but people talk about this so confusedly. Some people really love it, some people really hate it, and so I was apprehensive because I didn't know what I was gonna think about this story. But this is a little bit of a tangent, but this month I've been so obsessed with the show Weak Hero on Netflix. I'm currently, I think, in my 5th rewatch this month. It's basically all I watch in the evening. I love that show so much, but that's beside the point. It relates to this book because in the 2nd season, in the opening, they quote that, "I guess I'll just be the catcher in the rye and all," which the main character says. It gave me motivation to read this. And The Catcher in the Rye is the story of Holden Caulfield, who is maybe the most misunderstood main character ever. I had the most warped idea of what this was gonna be. He is 16 years old, but it said that he's mentally very immature, which clearly is because of trauma. It screams in your face. I don't know how anyone could misunderstand this little kid. He's just left his prep school where he was because he's been kicked out of there. It's the 4th or 5th time he's had to leave a school because he was kicked out. So he decides to go to New York in order to just spend some time there. He wants to escape his daily life. The writing style is almost juvenile. It's very simple, but I thought that gave it so much more depth because it's so relevant to Holden's character. Holden is a character with a lot of contradictions because physically he seems very mature. He's very tall and he has gray hair already, but mentally he's very much immature still. He's a bit behind his own age. That's clearly trauma. It's so clear. It screams you in the face, basically. He doesn't seem to have the emotional capacity to deal with it, and so he does not even try to consider that maybe he's just hurt. He reminds me a lot of the main character of No Longer Human in that way, just always presenting himself as the worst possible version of himself. Basically going through life thinking you're the worst person, and so trying constantly to prove to yourself that you are, but just from seeing the way he acts and the way he actually behaves towards people, he's just a little kid who's been hurt. He's so kind to people. He helps people a lot, but no one really seems to appreciate that or acknowledge that. Just one person being thankful to him and being kind to him has such a huge impact on him. Do not let yourself be influenced by the way people talk about this story, because I think if you read this with empathy and knowing that no one is perfect and no one's ever going to be perfect, especially when you're still very young and very hurt and very in denial about your own feelings and your own self, I think this is really worthwhile to read. I decided I wanted to reread No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai, which is one of my favorite books of all time. Dazai is one of my favorite authors of all time, and this book is one that means so much to me. And so I decided to reread it because The Catcher in the Rye just reminded me of the main character of this one so much, and nothing is quite as comforting as this book to me. It's when you feel a certain way, it's the most comforting thing you could read. At least that's what I think. I guess it's just, again, it's very personal to me, I suppose. This story follows our main character, who we follow from a very young age, and from a very young age, he's never felt like a human. He has never experienced basic human feelings like hunger, for example. And above all else, he's terrified of other people finding out that he's not human, as he says. And so he creates this sort of persona for himself where he smiles always and he makes a lot of jokes. He becomes the clown in the room. He masks himself completely. And his is a story of complete alienation from humanity. Of course, he's not perfect, especially the way he starts treating women at a certain point is less than great. To me, this reads like a character who's always either been clinically depressed and therefore never really felt like a human, or just maybe something else is going on. I don't want to presume anything, and I don't think it's important to the story to diagnose this man, because that's not the point at all. What I'm trying to say is, when you're depressed, I think this book is incredibly comforting, because depression, the fact that you stop feeling things, the complete lack of feeling and identity, the feeling of being sort of like a living dead kind of thing, like your body's still going on but your mind's just gone suddenly and your feelings are gone. That's the most alienating thing you could feel, I think, as a human, because the one thing we're meant to do is feel. But when you can't feel anymore, and when you look at people around you who still feel, that feels like the most alienating thing ever. And so I think that's why this book is so incredibly comforting to read when you go through something like that, at least for me personally. I find so much comfort here. Also, I think where this story gets misunderstood so much, at least to me, again, I'm speaking from my own opinion, is that the main character is telling his own story, much in the way that Holden does in The Catcher in the Rye. He thinks of himself as a monster, as a non-human entity. And so he thinks of himself as the worst possible thing that has ever existed, which is why the way he tells us about himself it's not reliable. He's not a reliable narrator. To me, a very impactful part is actually in the introduction. So I'm going to read you that. In a superb epilogue, the only objective witness testifies he was an angel. And we are suddenly made to realize the incompleteness of Yozo's portrait of himself. In the way that most men fail to see their own cruelty, Yozo has not noticed his gentleness and his capacity for love. Dazai is such a master of writing about humanity. His stories always feel so intimate. A lot of the things that happen to Yozo in this book actually happened to Dazai in his real life. I think this is a very, very special book. Next up, I read Sun and Steel, also by Yukio Mishima. The last time I spoke to you, I was like, I'm never gonna buy that book because as soon as I buy it, I'm gonna read it and then I won't have any Mishima left to read. Well, Cut to 2 weeks later, I've bought it and I've read it, and I've now read everything by Mishima. But honestly, I'm so excited to start rereading his books. I think this time I'm going to start chronologically. Sun and Steel is Yukio Mishima's essay on himself, on his way of writing, on his way of living. The sun in the title could be seen as words. Writing. His writing is his sun, I suppose. His words are his sun, whereas steel is the literal steel he creates muscle with, basically weights. The way it's basically symbolic for human strength and for the human body almost. And so this book deals a lot with the way he tries to cultivate both. Basically, his whole thing is trying to achieve a perfect and beautiful life. And to him, beauty is all about balance. He's so disciplined and so obsessed with this idea of mastering both the mind and the body. This also deals a lot with his romanticization of death as the ultimate mastering of life, which is very interesting because, of course, if you know anything about Mishima, he came from a samurai family, and he was very involved with very extremist ideals of restoring the old samurai way of life, the old culture of Japan in the eye of the increasing westernization of Japan. He was really hating what was going on in his culture at the time, and so he was one of those people who created extremist groups to try to restore the emperor to ultimate power. This book was so interesting because it gave you more of an insight of why he decided, because it was a very conscious decision to subscribe to such an ideal. Because to me, Mishima is such an interesting character because it almost seems so counterintuitive to read how beautifully and how philosophically he writes about life. His prose is beautiful. Read any book by him and you'll know exactly what I mean. But at the same time, he's so obsessed with violence and with death. And to me, that's the ultimate contrast. His books are so filled with contrast, and his personality, the way he actually was as a person, is so fascinating to me because it seems like such a contradiction. Just in general, if you're fascinated with human psychology, this is such an interesting book. I loved reading it so much. Then I read Die Leiden des jungen Werther by Goethe, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, which in English, The Sorrows of Young Werther. It's a book I've actually already read. I had to read this for school, but that was such a long time ago, and I had to read it, so I did not feel like I was doing the book justice back then. And so I decided I'm going to reread it this month, just because I was very interested in it. We follow this young guy called Werther, who's moved to this small town. There he becomes, he falls in love with a young woman who's already engaged though. So that's a bit of a conflict. The story is told through letters he writes, where he tells you about his emotional circumstances. He very quickly declines very, very far. And it's really at the end of the day his passion that's his downfall. There's also a lot of philosophy on life and on what death means, what creativity means, human relationships. It's a very multifaceted book. Read this little book, please. But of course, only if you feel like it. I'm not gonna force you, don't worry. Okay, next, the shortest book next to the longest book I read this month, which technically is not a book. This is the Complete Poems by Emily Dickinson. It's all of the poems this woman has ever written, or at least all of the poems we have access to nowadays. It's close to 2,000 poems. My God, I loved this so much. I had already talked about that there was this one show, Alias Grace, where there was this one poem. I felt a cleaving in my mind as if my brain had split. I tried to match it seam by seam, but could not make them fit. And I loved that excerpt of the poem so much that I really decided I want to know everything this woman has ever written. And so, of course, I had to buy this little tome, and it's been accompanying me the whole month. I think I've never spent as much time with a book as with this one, because usually I don't read books over a long period of time. I like to read them fairly quickly. That's just my personality. But this one, I really sporadically just picked it up when I wanted to. Sometimes I read 100 pages a day. Sometimes I read 10 pages a day. She's so brilliant and she's so unique. I've never read poetry like this. That being said, I'm not very educated in poetry. Poetry is not something I usually read. And I'm one of those really annoying people who really only likes poems that rhyme, which I know is so basic. But yeah, I'm just, poetry is not my forte, but I loved these ones. It's also, to me, poetry is the most intimate thing you can read of a person. To me, poetry just always feels the most intimate. And for this is so because only 10 of these were ever published in her lifetime. These poems then end up being even more intimate because they were never published. And so she was really free to express herself in any way she wanted to. And they are sometimes almost erotic, almost sensual. There's a lot of life and a lot of death and grief. Emily Dickinson experienced a lot of loss in her life, and she lived very isolated. She's the woman who basically never left her house, who was the weird woman of her town because no one ever got to see her. She never had any visitors. She never left her house. She lived almost in isolation, but she had these very intense pen pal relationship with other people and other poets. You just get a feeling about the kind of person she must have been, and she feels so at once almost melancholic, depressive, very, very sad at some points, very introspective and calm, but also so feisty and spicy, if you can say that. She feels like such a character. She must have been such a unique woman. I wish I could have met her, and I don't know, she seems so cool. And I'm so glad I read this because this woman did something with words that I've not seen done before. This is my favorite poem of it. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. And then it goes on, but I think I'm going to stop here. But because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. That line has not left my head since I've read it. I think that's so cool. So yeah, that's the complete poems of Emily Dickinson. I highly recommend those. Now, the final 4 books I read this month are all by the woman I think is my new favorite author of all time. I discovered her this month. Of course not, I knew about her, but this is the month where I decided to pick up her work. It's Han Kang. Oh my god, I love Han Kang so much. Why did no one tell me how brilliant this woman is? I mean, she won the Nobel Prize, so I suppose people did sort of tell me indirectly, but now I know for sure. The book I read first by her is The White Book. This is a book that's been in my shopping cart for months, but it never really felt right. I really like to wait until a book feels like I have to read it right now. And that moment came this month, and so I had to read it. And this and No Longer Human are the most comforting books I've ever read. They're the 2 books where I know whenever I feel down and feel bad and feel lost, I'm going to reread these 2 books specifically. They comfort me in a way that no other book ever has. This book is basically Han Kang's meditation on the color white. It's very symbolic and very, very brilliantly written. It's very, very short excerpts. There's like sometimes a chapter is only like a page long, but it's so brilliant. It's so intimate and so symbolic at the same time. It's basically her trying to grieve her sister's death, who died as an infant before she was ever born. And there's this one line that's so heartbreaking where she says something like, she was raised in her sibling's absence, that she would never have been born if her sibling hadn't died. And so the feeling of having to do justice to this gift of life she was given that her sister wasn't, and how, well, in the book there's 2 siblings that died before she was born, 2 siblings that died as infants. And so she talks about that, how she feels like she has to survive and she has to make the most of life because she gets to. because her siblings never did. And so it's heartbreaking and so quiet and so comforting and so brilliant and poetic. In the maybe top 4 books I've ever read. Please pick it up. I think it's so incredibly criminally underrated. Then I read Greek Lessons, which is a it's a very linguistic kind of book. We basically follow 2 main characters, a woman who's recently lost her ability to speak and a man who's losing his sight. The woman who's lost her ability to speak is attending these lessons to learn ancient Greek. The man we follow is her Greek professor. And so it's a very interesting sort of contemplation of language and what language means. Not just language, but senses in general, and how important those are for human life, and what it means when you lose them, and what that does to a person. Also, the way it's written is so brilliant because, first of all, the relationship between people, between characters, how brilliantly and profoundly that is explored is incredible, but also the way it's written, because we follow 1 chapter is in the woman's head, 1 chapter is in the man's head, but the woman who's lost her ability to speak, her chapters are in third person narrative. She literally doesn't have a voice. She does not talk for herself. She's talked about by the author. Whereas the chapters of the man who's lost his sight or losing his sight is in first person narrative because he has a voice. He can talk for himself. I really, really loved this book. This is the first author where every single book I've read by her is a 5-star book. I've never experienced that before. Read it. Highly recommend. Then I read Human Acts, also by Han Kang, which is one of the most heartbreaking books I've ever read. I think this is going to stay with me forever. And this is one of those books that really changed the way I think or feel, or it altered a little part in me. In a way, it's like Never Let Me Go, but this feels so much more raw and so much more intimate and so much sadder than Never Let Me Go, because this deals with a very true account of something horrific that happened, which basically Han Kang writes about an incident where in 1980, in a province in Korea, Gwangju, a massacre occurred where so many people were brutally murdered and tortured for standing up for their own rights, because Korea was under military law at the time. So basically civil rights were ineffective and people didn't really have rights. And these people in Gwangju protested that. And one of these protests became a massacre. And it's actually 2 separate instances of a massacre that took place 10 days apart. And the book follows this massacre through many different perspectives. It's so impactful. I won't really get into it because I think you have to experience this for yourself. Words do not do the depth of this book justice. What I will say is I've watched a lot of interviews about this book, and Han Kang lived in Gwangju up to a few months before the massacre happened. She was 10 years old when her family decided randomly to move away to Seoul, and a few months later this massacre occurred in their hometown. And she writes about how her entire family has basically carried this guilt of maybe someone in Gwangju died in our stead because we were no longer there. This deals with the horrific impact that a massacre like this has on each individual person, and how that guilt and that trauma is carried on through generations. She did this book so much justice, this instance so much justice, and she did that without ever interviewing a single one of the bereaved people, because she said she did not feel she had the right to reopen those wounds, which I think she handles this thing with so much dignity. And she gives these people a voice, and she fights for their rights in a way by writing the story. She raises awareness for this horrific instance that happened that is still sort of not really talked about at all, or at least not enough. Also, just the juxtaposition of the absolute brutality that people are capable of, in combination with the greatness and the dignity and the beauty that a community can create and can feel and is capable of in the face of this extreme violence. It's a book about every extreme of humanity, done in such a dignified and such a beautiful way. And I highly recommend this story. If you're a human, read this book. And then lastly, I read We Do Not Part, also by Han Kang, of course. This is in many ways almost a continuation of Human Acts. The main character in this story is basically dealing with the traumatic after effects of having researched for a book about an incident in Gwangju. I don't know how autobiographical this is, but there's clearly there's clearly very personal undertones in this story. Kyunga is the name of this writer in this story who's dealing with those effects. It has horrific effects on her personal life and on her health. She is contacted by one of her very close friends who has had an accident and who is asking her to go to Jeju Island because the writer lives in Seoul, but her friend lives in Jeju Island. She's basically asking Kyunga to go to Jeju Island because she has a bird that she cannot take care of now, and the bird is going to die soon if no one goes there to take care of her. And so Kyunga basically embarks on the journey to Jeju Island in order to take care of this bird. It deals both with the effects that this Gwangju incident had on Kyunga, but also the friend, her mother, was affected by a different massacre that happened in Jeju Island with very similar motivations as what happened in Gwangju. It's a lot about the grief that is carried on through generations, very similar to Human Acts, but also very different. This book feels even more quiet and meditative than Human Acts does, which in Human Acts that already impressed me so much. And so I think these two are very great companions to be read together, and I think you should definitely read Human Acts before you read We Do Not Part. It's a story about loss and generational trauma and humanity as a whole, a story about love and friendship and kindness and just life and what life means and what it means when life is lost and how we deal with that. Han Kang's stories are so enriching to read. It's such an honor to get to exist at the same time as this woman, to walk this earth, breathe the air that this woman breathes. I don't know, I have so much respect and admiration for her. And yeah, with that, I'm gonna love you and leave you. That's all the books I read in May. It was an incredible reading month. I don't think I've ever had this many incredible books and authors in a singular month. I feel very enriched now and so grateful that I get to read all of these books and share them with all of you. I hope maybe you found something interesting in here that maybe you're now going to decide to pick up. Who knows? And yeah, thank you so much for being here. I wish you all the best, and we'll see each other again very, very soon. Bye.